From many Muslims, you will hear the claim that the 40-year-old Isaac married the 3-year-old Rebekah and use this claim as a polemic against Christians. This polemic became popular amongst them because Christians pointed out and condemned Muhammad's marriage to Aisha because Muhammad was over 50, whilst Aisha was 6. In response, some Muslims tried to use this polemic against Christians. To clarify, the Christian argument against Muhammad based off of Muhammad's alleged marriage is going to be something around the lines of 1. Anyone who is substantially above 18 who marries a minor and consummates the marriage commits a serious and grave sin. So, if someone who is above 50 years old and marries someone who is below 10 and consummates the marriage, they commit a grave sin. But Muhammad married Aisha and consummated the marriage when he was above 50 and she was below 10. So Muhammad committed a grave sin. But if Islam is true, then whatever Muhammad did is an example for all mankind and cannot be a sin. So if Islam is true, Muhammad could not have committed such a grave sin. Thus, if Muhammad did commit such a grave sin, then Islam would be false. But since, as mentioned above, Muhammad did do such a sin, Islam is false. Now, someone can formulate this in a different way, but regardless, the Christian argument against Islam is usually going to involve someone pointing out the marriage, then pointing out said marriage is immoral, and then showing how Islam doesn't allow for their prophets to be immoral in such a way, and or show that Islam condones the marriage as being good. From there, the Christian will conclude that Islam is false because it condones something which is immoral. But in response to this, some Muslims tried to claim that Isaac was 40 and Rebekah was 3 when they got married, so you also have this problem. Firstly, this polemic by Muslims is really just a tu quoque. Now, a tu quoque is just going to be an attempt at refuting some argument by merely charging the accuser with the same issue without addressing the original argument either explicitly or implicitly. So, they're just trying to say that you have a similar issue. It doesn't actually deal with the Christian argument, but merely says that, but you also have to deal with this. For example, even if we suppose that Christians are hypocritical for condemning Muhammad but not Isaac, that wouldn't actually help get Muslims away from the argument originally posed against them. It's really just a diversion from the argument. Secondly, the Muslim polemic against this argument involving mentioning the age of Rebekah doesn't even manage to fully reverse this argument on the Christians. All it does is say Rebekah was 3, Isaac was 40, they were married, but it doesn't prove that Christians must therefore condone said actions, or say that Isaac did not sin when he did such an act. Christians do not hold to the idea that all prophets are sinless. Thus, even if it is true that Rebekah was 3, there would be no issue in our paradigm with us saying Isaac was a sinner. Therefore, there isn't any hypocrisy on the part of the Christians for critiquing Muhammad for marrying a minor. But suppose we were to truly reverse the argument to turn it against the Bible, we would get this following set of premises. 1. Anyone who is substantially above 18 who marries a minor and consummates the marriage commits a serious and grave sin. So, if someone who is 40 years old and marries someone who is below 10 and consummates the marriage, they commit a grave sin. But Isaac, married to a 3-year-old when he was 40, consummated the marriage. So Isaac committed a grave sin. But if Christianity is true, then whatever Isaac did is an example for mankind and cannot be a sin. Thus, if Isaac did commit such a grave sin, then Christianity would be false. But since, as mentioned above, Isaac did do such a sin, Christianity is false. In order for Muslims to successfully use the claim that Isaac married a 3-year-old when he was 40 as an argument, they would have to prove something akin to these premises here. Yet, premise 5 is false. As said before, we do not hold that the patriarchs are sinless. Now, what I have said above is actually sufficient to refute the polemic. The patriarchs aren't sinless, and thus we have no issue with saying that Isaac did something wrong in our paradigm. Muslims, however, cannot make the same claims about Muhammad. However, everything I said prior to this about the polemic doesn't change the core claim of it, because it doesn't actually address whether she was 3 or not. So, what this shows is that even if we were to bite the bullet on Rebekah being 3, it wouldn't be sufficient as an argument against Christians. Regardless, we can challenge the premise that Rebekah was 3 years old and say that it is unjustified and or false. Thus, the argument would also fail because of that. So, when Muslims are asked for evidence that Rebekah was 3 from the biblical text, they will typically respond with an argument that goes as follows. 1. Sarah was 90 when Abraham was 100. 2. Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born. 3. Sarah died at age 127. 4. Isaac was 40 when he married Rebekah. 5. Sarah was 90 when Isaac was born. 6. Isaac was 37 when his mother Sarah died. 7. Rebekah was born when Sarah died. Therefore, Rebekah was 3 when she married Isaac, who was 40. The entire argument is contingent upon 7 and doesn't work without it. But that is the very issue with this argument. 7 isn't true. In Genesis chapter 22, verses 20 through 24, is when Abraham learns about Rebekah from a messenger. First of all, we must note that we don't know how long it took for the message to arrive from Rebekah's household. Literally no information is given. Furthermore, we already know that time jumps happen in this exact biblical text. In Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 through 8, Isaac is born and then later weaned, but in Genesis chapter 22 verse 1 it says, sometime after, and then it jumps to an entirely new and ambiguous time. We know, however, that some considerable time has passed, given that before Isaac was just a child who had to be weaned, but now he's able to have a conversation with his father. Furthermore, Isaac is bound up, which, if he were still to be a very young child, like he was in the chapter prior, wouldn't be necessary. And the fact that the word na'ar used in Genesis chapter 22, verse 12 to describe Isaac is, according to the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, a word used to describe someone of male who is available for marriage and is not yet betrothed. Thus, there is a time jump. This already creates problems for the view that she was 3, because Rebekah is born at a time, X. Then, some amount of time, Y, passes, and Rebekah's birth is made known to Abraham. This would put Abraham's learning of Rebekah at time X plus Y. Then, after a length of time Z, Sarah dies. So Sarah dies at time X plus Y plus Z. As we can see, these X, Y, and Z, which symbolize the time past, are unknown. We simply cannot tell Rebekah's age using this. This already makes it impossible to give an age of Rebekah based off the ages, let alone confidently say that she was 3. So therefore, we cannot use the ages to calculate Rebekah's age as 3, because we can't assume that Rebekah's birth was when Sarah died. Ultimately, there is no reason to think that. So far, I've only really attacked one of the premises in the argument that Rebekah was 3, but we can actually attack the argument in its entirety. This is because numbers in the Torah, especially ages, are not meant to be taken literally. This is something pointed out by biblical scholar Lloyd R. Bailey in 1996. After he analyzed the usage and significance of numbers in the Torah contextually. The numbers are symbolic and not meant to be literal. For example, Joseph's age of 110 symbolizes how he lived the Egyptian perfect life, because in Egypt the number 110 was associated with that. It is not, however, meant to tell us that Joseph literally lived to 110. We cannot therefore use the numbers given to tell literal ages of the patriarchs, and thus we cannot even use the numbers at all to date anyone or calculate the age of anyone, let alone Rebekah. This puts not just a hole in the argument, but tears it apart completely. Okay, so it seems the argument from the ages of the patriarchs doesn't work. However, some Muslims would like to point to Genesis chapter 24, verse 16, which says, "Now the young woman, Na'arah, was very beautiful." Specifically, they will point to the usage of the word Na'arah, translated as young woman, and will say that it points to Rebekah being a minor. However, this is not true, as the word is used to describe women who are of marriageable age. For example, the Brown Driver Briggs Concordance states that the word means young girl only in 2 Kings chapter 5 verse 2, but means young daughters, young woman, and even young widow in other places. Most importantly, the word means young woman who is marriageable in Genesis chapter 24 verse 16. Similarly, the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament says that this word is used for young widows and newly married women. This also fits the other data that I will go on to mention about how Betula is used and its relation to her age. Clearly, therefore, this does not state she is anywhere near the age of 3. According to the text of Genesis chapter 35 verse 8, Rebekah had a nurse. So, if nurses are for kids, then it would follow that Rebekah was a minor. No, but here it simply doesn't follow, because nurses aren't just for minors in this context. We need not bring in our own cultural situation into the ancient Near Eastern cultural context. For instance, Neo-Babylonian dowries sometimes include the awarding of a female slave as a personal nurse to the bride, most likely intended to help the bride adjust to her new surroundings, which fleshes out the meager references to this practice in Genesis. Furthermore, Genesis chapter 35 verse 8 happens well after Rebekah has kids, Genesis chapter 5 verse 24. So, by this point, she must have been mature enough to give birth and be a mother, hence we cannot assume that having a nurse entails being immature and a minor. Now that the biblical texts that are used to support this polemic have been addressed, we can move on to the supposed extra-biblical arguments used. Specifically, some like to point to rabbis who state Rebekah was 3 when she was married, but to this we can merely say, 1. The rabbis hold no authority over Christians, Muslims, and atheists. This is especially the case for Christians and Muslims, given that the rabbis reject Jesus and Muhammad. Their exegesis of Scripture has no inherent authority over either Muslims or Christian. 2. The rabbi saying something doesn't matter if they don't have the data/evidence to support it. This is especially the case if the text goes against what they say. 3. The rabbis disagreed on the age of Rebekah. Furthermore, the rabbis aren't even the only exegetes of the text. This is because the Book of Jubilees, a text which is far earlier than the rabbinic literature as it dates before the 1st century AD, this book states that Rebekah was actually 20 years old, and it is far earlier than any of the rabbinic traditions. If we want to look at how our earliest exegetes viewed the texts, then the Book of Jubilees would be the place to go. For it is completely arbitrary to go to rabbis which say Rebekah was 3, when while doing this you ignore other exegetes, modern and ancient, which state that she was above 3. It is simply arbitrary to appeal to certain exegetes whilst ignoring others when the data gives us sufficient reasons to prefer the exegetes who say she was 3 over the ones who say she wasn't. On the contrary, it seems there is sufficient evidence to show that we should put more trust in the exegetes who state that she was well above 3 given the data covered above. Now, some Muslims could attack the first point by saying that Christians actually do have to take the rabbis as authorities, pointing to Matthew chapter 23, verse 3, which reads, "Therefore pay attention to what they, i.e. the Pharisees, tell you and do it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they preach." Put fully in context, Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 11 reads, "Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, 'The experts in the law and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore pay attention to what they tell you and do it, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy loads, hard to carry, and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing even to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by people, for they make their phylacteries wide and their tassels long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues and elaborate greetings in the marketplaces, and to have all the people call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Nor are you to be called teacher, for you have one teacher, the Christ. The greatest among you will be your servant." From this passage, the Muslim will argue that therefore we are required to take the interpretation of the rabbis as being authoritative. Although I plan to make a full and in-depth video here, we can point out a couple brief objections to this. 1. The latter rabbinic Jews and the rabbis aren't going to be the Pharisees of Jesus' day, which is what this passage is referring to. On the contrary, the rabbis may have their descendants from the Second Temple Jews, but what the Second Temple Jews believed isn't necessarily what the rabbis believed, and vice versa. Similarly, anything from the Talmud need not be merely accepted as being the opinion from the Second Temple period, let alone being the consensus of the Pharisees at the Second Temple period. Therefore, Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 11 does nothing to help the polemic, even if we say that we should listen to the Pharisees of Jesus' day. 2. The context of the passage shows that obedience is qualified. The experts in the law and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, pay attention to what they tell you and do it. The argument here is that the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, therefore do as they do. However, Jesus' argument is then going to be an inference based off the premise that they sit on Moses' seat. The Pharisees sat on Moses' seat when they were teaching what was in the Torah. For instance, if I say, the Smith family has a member who has angered quickly, therefore be careful with what you say, is qualified because if the Smith family didn't have such a family member, or if that family member weren't around, then I wouldn't necessarily have to be as careful with what I say. Therefore, this is merely telling the disciples to affirm the scriptures even if they reject what the Pharisees do. This, however, doesn't tell them to follow the Pharisees' own interpretations and/or oral traditions. 3. To add on to the previous point about the command being directly qualified, Jesus himself denies the Pharisees' own interpretation of the texts, alongside with their oral traditions. In fact, just before Matthew chapter 23, Jesus challenges the Pharisees' understanding of Scripture. Matthew chapter 22 verses 41 through 44 ends right before chapter 23 begins, and yet Jesus asks the Pharisees how the Messiah can be the son of David and yet also the Lord of David. The answer to this question is the incarnation. Jesus, through his humanity, is the son of David, but through his divinity, Jesus is his God. Yet the Pharisees do not get this because they don't share Jesus' wisdom of the Old Testament. Even well before Matthew chapter 22, Jesus challenged their traditions and interpretations in Matthew chapter 15 verses 1 through 20 because they were complaining that Jesus didn't follow their traditions about the Sabbath and hand washing. Even earlier, Jesus in Matthew chapter 12 verses 1 through 9 challenges the Pharisees' interpretation of the Sabbath. Of this passage, Keener, 2009, writes, Jesus' first example is the story of the breach in the law of David in an emergency. The man of God and his companions were hungry. Although his opponents may have insisted on beginning with an explicit legal text, Jesus appeals instead to inspired narrative to show how God expected the legal statements should be qualified in practice, a precedent for allowing hunger to override the law. For the Pharisees have objected that the David story addressed forbidden food rather than the Sabbath would have missed the point. Jesus challenges not merely their interpretation of the Sabbath, but their entire method of legal interpretation. Because the high priest thought that David had companions with him, his actions indicate the kind of exceptions that both David and the high priest thought appropriate. Whether or not David was lying, he probably was. If Jesus uses narrative precedent to qualify legal texts in this way, Matthew surely provides here a hermeneutical key for Jesus' non-legal teachings, radical, succinct statements usually unqualified. For example, one should compare Jesus' demands with his relative patience in not repudiating his disciples. So, since Jesus himself explicitly and knowingly denies the Pharisees' oral tradition, it is therefore not the case that Matthew chapter 23 has him saying that we should follow everything the Pharisees said in terms of interpretation in oral tradition, let alone follow what the later rabbis said. Now, from all that has been said here, it is clear that Jesus is not saying that we have to listen to a specific rabbi who doesn't even necessarily represent the consensus of rabbinic Judaism when he gives an interpretation of Rebekah's age. Now, since the arguments covered above do not work to show Rebekah was 3, the argument has been sufficiently dealt with because I've undercut the justification for the premise that Rebekah was 3. Since I'm merely negating the claim that is being used against Christians, it's not actually my burden to prove the premise wrong for me to refute the argument. Rather, I merely have to show how the claim lacks sufficient evidence for it, and thus we can dismiss it. However, we can go further than just showing the premise has no sufficient evidence, because we can show that the text of Genesis actually goes against it. So in the text of Genesis, there's a couple of facts to observe when it comes to Rebekah. 1. Genesis chapter 24, verses 15 through 16, states that Rebekah was able to walk and run on her own to a well, get a jug of water, get water from the well into the jug, and then carry that jug on her shoulder. It is highly unlikely and practically impossible for a 3-year-old to do all of this, especially carrying a heavy water jug on her shoulder. 2. Genesis chapter 24 verses 18 through 19 and chapter 24 verse 28 implies that she is capable of having full conversations with adults. Number 3. The Hebrew word betula is used to describe her in Genesis chapter 24 verse 16. Now, the first and third points are most important. The first point alone seems to indicate that Rebekah's age was well above 3. The third point, however, at first may not seem relevant, but it is. As Sarna writes, Betula, like its cognates Akkadian Betultu, Ugaritic Betlat, Arabic Betul, Syriac Betultha, does not by itself, without further definition, exclusively express virginity in the physical sense understood by the English word. Rather, the primary denotation is chronological. The term denotes sexually mature young girl of marriageable age, whether married or not. Thus, Joel chapter 1 verse 8 can use the figure of a maiden, Betula, lamenting for the husband of her youth, and an Aramaic incantation text speaks of Betultha who is pregnant. Similarly, Wenham translates verse 16 as, the girl was very good looking, of marriageable age, and a virgin. He furthermore writes that the word would connotate a girl's age range, approximately a teenager, Given that she was of marriageable age, this would imply she was actually around 16 to 19, as a marriageable age is roughly 16 to 19, as Ezekiel chapter 16 verses 7 through 9 says that the age of love, i.e. marriage, was after puberty. So, what we can see now is that 1. Even if Rebekah was 3, all that means is that Isaac sinned. We are not bound to take the view that Isaac is sinless, hence this polemic fails to even get off the ground when trying to show a flaw in Christian morality. 2. The biblical text does not prove that she was 3. In fact, the biblical text goes against that. 3. The extra biblical citations do not work to prove the polemical case.